My mom spent years blaming me for everything, until I exposed her biggest lie in front of the whole family, and then, for as long as I can remember, my mother, Vivian, has treated me like I was the source of every problem in her life. It never mattered what went wrong. If the groceries were put away incorrectly, if a family argument erupted, if a bill was paid late. Somehow, she always managed to trace it back to me. My younger brother, Jordan, was the perfect one, the golden child who could do no wrong. If he made a mistake, there was always a convenient excuse ready to shield him from responsibility, and more often than not, I was the one who took the blame. Growing up, I tried to fight back, to argue my side, but it was useless. My mother never admitted she was wrong, and the more I protested, the more she twisted the situation until I looked like the problem. It wasn't until I turned 30 that I started realizing just how deep this manipulation ran. I had spent years convincing myself that maybe I was just being too sensitive or too dramatic. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it felt. But every time I tried to rationalize it, something would happen to remind me exactly who she was. And this time, it was Christmas. I had been struggling financially for a while, doing my best to manage my bills while saving up for gifts. I knew I couldn't afford anything extravagant, so I picked out a thoughtful but practical gift for Jordan, something I knew he'd actually use. I was proud of it, even if it wasn't flashy. But when I arrived at the family gathering, I realized my mother had already been spreading her own version of the story. She had been telling everyone that I had gone all out for Jordan, making it sound like I had spent a fortune. She was practically gloating, as if my gift to him was somehow a reflection of her success as a mother. The moment he unwrapped it and the room fell into an awkward silence, I felt the shift. I didn't even get a chance to explain before Vivian launched into a dramatic sigh, shaking her head like I had just committed an unforgivable crime. She didn't yell, didn't call me names outright. That wasn't her style. Instead, she made a show of looking heartbroken, as if I had personally betrayed her. Then came the carefully crafted comments, perfectly designed to make me look bad, while making her appear as the wounded victim. "I don't understand," she said, her voice laced with artificial disappointment. "You had so much time to prepare, and you knew how much Jordan has done for you over the years. I just thought you'd want to show some appreciation." That was all it took. In a matter of seconds, the atmosphere in the room shifted, and suddenly, the problem wasn't that she had lied. It was that I had let her down. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure of whether to intervene or just let the moment pass. Jordan, of course, looked awkward but said nothing, just like always. He had grown up with this dynamic, with our mother controlling every narrative, and deep down, I wasn't sure he even realized how much he had been conditioned to believe her version of reality. I wanted to argue, to explain that I had spent what I could afford, that I had put genuine thought into the gift, but I knew better. Any attempt to defend myself would be turned against me. If I tried to explain, I would be called defensive. If I got frustrated, I would be labeled dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I would be accused of sulking. It was a game I couldn't win, and my mother was the undefeated champion. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every moment over and over in my head. This wasn't new. This was a pattern, a cycle I had been trapped in for as long as I could remember. Every holiday, every family event, every major life moment, I was always the one at fault. It wasn't just about this one night, and it certainly wasn't about the gift. This was about control. She needed me to be the problem so that she could always be the victim. I thought back to the countless times she had done this before. When my parents divorced, I was barely 12, struggling to make sense of why my family was falling apart. But somehow, I still became the villain. She told everyone that my difficult attitude had made things harder for everyone, conveniently leaving out the screaming matches she and my father had on a near-daily basis. When she forgot to pay a bill and got slapped with a late fee, she told my relatives that I had distracted her that week with my constant need for attention. When Jordan struggled in school, she painted a story about how I hadn't been a good enough role model. Even when the dog ran away, she managed to spin a tale about how I must have been careless with the gate, despite the fact that I hadn't even been home when it happened. For years, I had accepted it. I had told myself that this was just how families were, that I just needed to be patient, that maybe one day she would change. But that night, for the first time, I saw it for what it was. She wasn't going to change. She had no reason to, because it worked. She twisted reality, and people believed her. But what if, for once, I had proof? What if, instead of getting trapped in another cycle of he said, she said, I had real, undeniable evidence of the way she operated? What if I could show everyone that this wasn't just miscommunication or occasional misunderstandings? This was a deliberate, calculated pattern. I picked up my phone and opened a blank document. I started writing down everything I could remember, dates, incidents, exact words she had used. I scrolled through old text messages, saving screenshots of conversations where she had contradicted herself. I started recording voice memos, not to share with anyone yet, but just so I had a record. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting to her games. I was preparing for them. I didn't know exactly how this would play out, but one thing was certain. Next time she tried to throw me under the bus, I wasn't going down without a fight. A few weeks after Christmas, I found myself walking into yet another family gathering, this time at my aunt's house, already bracing for whatever narrative my mother had prepared. I had barely stepped through the door when I heard her voice, loud and deliberate, carrying through the crowded living room like she wanted everyone to hear. She was talking about my aunt, specifically about how she had decided not to show up tonight, and before I even had a chance to process the conversation, she had already found a way to pin it on me. Well, you know how these things go, she sighed dramatically, pausing just long enough to ensure the room was paying attention. After everything that happened between her and Madeline, I'm not surprised she didn't come. Some people just hold on to grudges forever. I stopped mid-step, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral as I glanced around the room. My mother was perched in the kitchen, speaking to a small group of relatives who nodded along, clearly uncertain but too polite to question her. My brother was sitting in the corner, scrolling through his phone, entirely uninterested in the conversation, probably unaware that he was once again the passive witness to our mother's lies. The argument she was referring to wasn't even an argument, at least not in any real sense. 3 years ago, at a summer barbecue, my aunt and I had disagreed over something trivial, something so insignificant that I could barely remember the details. The next day, we had laughed about it over coffee, brushing it off as nothing more than a minor difference of opinion. Yet somehow, my mother had taken that forgettable moment and repurposed it into a full-blown feud, stretching it into something it had never been, using it as a weapon to shift attention away from herself. I walked into the kitchen, my heartbeat steady but my mind already piecing together how best to respond. If I reacted too emotionally, I would be proving her right, confirming that I was irrational and prone to conflict. If I denied it outright, she would twist my words into another performance, acting wounded that I was trying to rewrite history. Instead, I chose a different approach, one I had been preparing for since Christmas night. I actually spoke to Aunt Monica earlier this week, I said, my voice deliberately calm as I set my purse down on the counter. She told me she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to risk getting anyone sick, so she decided to stay home. The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable. A few relatives glanced at each other, their previous hesitance now turning into something closer to skepticism. My mother froze for a brief second, her carefully rehearsed line now colliding with the reality I had just presented. "Oh well," she said quickly, a forced laugh slipping through her lips. "I'm sure that played a part in it. But let's be honest, she was never that excited to come in the first place." I tilted my head slightly, studying her reaction, watching as the first crack in her performance started to show. She wasn't used to being challenged in real time. Normally, she controlled the narrative, setting the tone before anyone had a chance to question her. But this time, I had spoken first, cutting through the manipulation before it had a chance to spread. Casually, I turned to my cousin, who had been sipping her drink in the corner, observing the exchange with an expression that hinted at amusement. "You talked to Monica recently, right?" I asked, feigning curiosity as if I didn't already know the answer. My cousin nodded immediately, placing her glass on the counter. Yeah, I did. She told me the same thing, that she wasn't feeling great and didn't want to risk it. The confirmation sealed it. My mother's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before she pivoted, shifting gears so smoothly that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have believed it was her plan all along. Well, it's hard to know what's really going on, she said, waving a dismissive hand as she turned to grab a serving dish. Either way, it's a shame she didn't make it. The moment could have ended there, but I wasn't done yet. Instead of letting her escape, I kept watching, waiting to see what she would do next. Sure enough, rather than admitting she had been wrong, she immediately found a new target, redirecting the conversation to a different cousin, suggesting that maybe Monica's absence had more to do with a disagreement over family finances. The deflection was so transparent that even Jordan, who normally stayed out of everything, looked slightly uncomfortable. Over the next hour, I watched as the pattern repeated itself, almost like clockwork. When the food wasn't ready exactly on time, she made a point to remind everyone that I had spent too much time chatting instead of helping in the kitchen, despite the fact that I had arrived barely 10 minutes ago. When one of the younger kids spilled a drink, she jokingly remarked that clumsiness must run in the family, her eyes flickering toward me just long enough to make it clear who she was really talking about. When a conversation about an old family trip came up, she effortlessly reworked the details, spinning a version of events where I had somehow caused unnecessary tension, even though I remembered it going a completely different way. I had always noticed her doing this, but this was the first time I had documented it. Every time she twisted a story, I made a mental note, storing it away for later. Every time she shifted blame onto me, I paid attention to how people reacted, watching for those moments when her stories didn't quite add up. Even my cousins, who had once gone along with her narratives simply out of habit, were starting to exchange knowing glances, silently acknowledging what had always been hidden in plain sight. By the time dinner was over, I could feel the weight of the evening settling around me. Normally, I would have left feeling exhausted, mentally drained from another night of being the designated villain in my mother's carefully constructed world. But this time, I felt something different. It wasn't exhaustion. It was clarity. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down, expecting another meaningless group chat notification, but instead, I saw a message from one of my cousins. I don't know how you deal with her. The way she twists things is exhausting. You're not crazy. I see it now. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't alone in this. Others were starting to see what I had always known. My mother's control over the family was not as ironclad as she believed it to be. And if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, it was only a matter of time before the entire illusion came crashing down. A few days after the dinner party, my dad asked if I could come over to help him clear out some old paperwork. He had recently moved into a smaller house after finalizing the last part of his divorce from my mother, and the sheer volume of documents he had accumulated over the years was overwhelming. I didn't mind helping, especially since it gave me an excuse to get out of my own head for a while. After spending so much time dealing with my mother's manipulation, sorting through tax returns and insurance forms felt like a strangely peaceful task. We worked through boxes stacked high in his living room, going through decades' worth of receipts, contracts, and financial records. I was flipping through a stack of folders when something caught my eye, a thick file labeled Education Fund in my dad's neat handwriting. I hesitated for a moment before pulling it out, curiosity flickering in the back of my mind. I had always known that there was a fund set up for Jordan's college expenses, something my parents had created years ago when they were still together. My dad had always described it as a joint account, something both he and my mother had contributed to equally. But as I flipped through the records, something didn't add up. The deposits were almost exclusively from my father's income, with very few contributions from my mother over the years. That alone didn't surprise me. She had always been skilled at making it look like she did more than she actually did, but what caught my attention were the withdrawals. There were far more of them than I had expected, and the amounts were significantly higher than what my brother's tuition and fees should have cost. Some of them were vague, listed under generic descriptions like living expenses or academic costs, but others were impossible to ignore. A five-figure withdrawal made during the same month that my mother had taken an expensive vacation. Another large transaction that perfectly aligned with the down payment she had put on a new car. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. She had been siphoning money from the fund for years, spending it on herself while letting my father believe it was all going toward Jordan's education. I turned to my dad, the file still open in my lap, my voice careful but firm. Did you know about these withdrawals? Some of these numbers don't make any sense compared to what Jordan's school costs should have been. He frowned, taking the folder from my hands, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing tension in his jaw. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just flipping through the statements over and over again, like he was trying to make the numbers add up in his head. Finally, he let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe anger, maybe disappointment, maybe both. I trusted her to handle the payments, he admitted, his fingers tightening around the edges of the documents. She always said she had everything under control, so I never thought to question it. But this isn't what we agreed on. The weight of his words settled between us, thick and suffocating. For years, my mother had painted herself as the responsible one, the one who had held everything together while my father had supposedly been absent and detached. But the numbers didn't lie. She had taken the money meant for Jordan's future and used it to fund her own life, all while continuing to play the part of the self-sacrificing mother. I needed more answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. That night, I called Jordan, keeping my voice casual as I steered the conversation toward his college expenses. I asked him if he had ever struggled to cover his tuition or if our mother had ever mentioned having to pull extra money from the fund to help him. He sounded confused at first, as if he had never even considered the possibility. He told me that as far as he knew, everything had been taken care of without issue. His response only confirmed what I already suspected. He had never been aware of what was really happening because he had no reason to question it. My mother had reassured him that everything was fine, that the money was being handled the way it was supposed to be, and he had believed her. Why wouldn't he? She had spent our entire lives making sure he saw her as infallible, the perfect mother who could do no wrong. The next day, I went back to my dad's house, this time determined to go through every single transaction in the education fund. We sat at his kitchen table for hours, line by line, cross-referencing dates with known expenses, trying to piece together the full scope of what had happened. By the time we were finished, the truth was undeniable. Thousands of dollars had been funneled out of the account, with only a fraction of it actually being spent on Jordan's education. For the first time in my life, I saw something shift in my father. He had always been reluctant to confront my mother, preferring to avoid conflict whenever possible, but this time, he didn't have a choice. This wasn't just emotional manipulation. This was financial deception. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt. "I can't believe I let this go on for so long," he said finally, his voice thick with frustration. "I should have paid closer attention. I should have questioned things sooner." I could hear the guilt in his voice, the weight of regret settling onto his shoulders. But this wasn't just about hindsight. This was about what happened next. "We need to confront her," I said, my words coming out firmer than I expected. "Not just you, me, Jordan, and the rest of the family. She's been getting away with this for years, and if we don't expose it now, she's just going to keep doing it." My dad hesitated, rubbing a hand over his face before nodding slowly. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No more letting her spin the story in her favor. We lay everything out, and we make sure there's no way for her to twist it." The decision was made. We were going to call a family meeting, one where my mother would have to answer for everything she had done. For years, she had controlled the narrative, making sure I was always the problem, making sure she was always the victim. But this time, the truth was on my side. And this time, she wasn't going to talk her way out of it. The family meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at my dad's house, and as the day approached, I could feel the tension building. My mother had no idea what was coming, but she must have sensed something shifting because she had been calling around to different relatives, subtly trying to poison the well before anything had even happened. She framed it as concern, asking if anyone had noticed me acting strangely, or if they had seen any signs that I was holding on to resentment over past issues. It was classic Vivian, laying the groundwork for her defense before she even knew what she was being accused of. Despite her best efforts, the turnout was better than I had expected. My dad was there, of course, along with Jordan, though he still seemed conflicted about the entire situation. Several aunts and uncles had shown up, including Monica, the aunt my mother had falsely accused me of driving away. Even some extended family members who usually stayed out of drama had made an appearance, clearly sensing that whatever was about to happen wasn't just another petty disagreement. The weight of what we were about to do settled heavily on my shoulders, but I reminded myself why we were here. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. This was about making sure that, for the first time in her life, my mother couldn't manipulate her way out of accountability. Vivian arrived last, walking through the front door with the same air of confidence she always carried. She had no idea what was waiting for her, no idea that, for the first time, the room she was walking into wasn't already under her control. She greeted everyone warmly, acting as if this were just another casual gathering, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she scanned the room. When she finally looked at me, there was a flicker of something almost amused, like she was waiting for me to slip up so she could turn the conversation back in her favor. My dad was the one who started, keeping his voice even but firm as he explained why we had called the meeting. He told her that we had been reviewing financial records, that we had noticed discrepancies in the education fund, and that we needed answers about where the money had actually gone. He didn't accuse her outright, not yet, but he laid the facts out clearly, making it impossible for her to dismiss them as misunderstandings. At first, she played innocent, tilting her head slightly as if she were genuinely confused by the entire thing. She acted like the very suggestion that she had misused the money was ridiculous, shaking her head with just the right amount of practiced disbelief. But when my dad started pulling out the documents, showing her the numbers, listing the specific withdrawals that had nothing to do with Jordan's education, her expression changed. She stopped looking confused and started looking irritated, her lips pressing together as she let out a short, forced laugh. "You're making this sound so much worse than it actually is," she said, crossing her arms as she glanced around the room, clearly looking for support. "I had to use some of that money for household expenses because your father wasn't exactly contributing as much as he should have been. That was her first mistake." My dad immediately shut it down, pointing out that nearly all the deposits had come from him and that there was no record of her ever putting money into the account. Her face tightened, but she recovered quickly, shaking her head as if she were disappointed in all of us for not seeing the bigger picture. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," she said, her voice shifting into the tone she always used when she was trying to make herself the victim. "I did what I had to do for this family, and instead of being grateful, you're sitting here attacking me like I'm some kind of criminal." I had expected her to play the victim, but I hadn't expected Jordan to finally break his silence. He had been sitting quietly, watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, but something about her words must have struck a nerve because, for the first time in his life, he challenged her. "You told me my tuition was covered," he said, his voice quieter than hers, but carrying far more weight. "You made it sound like everything was fine, like you had it all handled. But if that money wasn't being spent on school, then what was it really paying for?" She turned to him with wide, wounded eyes, reaching out like she wanted to comfort him, but he didn't move. He just kept looking at her, waiting for an answer she couldn't give. When she realized that the usual tricks weren't going to work, she turned her attention back to me, her gaze sharpening as she decided to shift tactics. "I should have known this was your doing," she spat, her voice laced with something venomous as she pointed a finger in my direction. "You've always been so desperate to turn this family against me, always stirring up trouble just because you can't stand seeing other people happy." The old me might have taken the bait, might have let myself get flustered, defensive, overwhelmed by the weight of her accusations. But this time, I was prepared. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't let her accusations steer the conversation away from the actual issue. Instead, I calmly pulled out my laptop, connected it to the television, and started the slideshow I had prepared. The first slide was simple, a timeline of deposits and withdrawals, with clear labels showing exactly where the money had gone. The second slide showed receipts for personal purchases, designer handbags, an expensive vacation, the down payment on the car she had bought for herself but had told everyone was a gift from a business friend. With each slide, the room grew quieter, the tension thick enough to suffocate. By the time I reached the last slide, a side-by-side comparison of what Jordan's tuition should have cost versus what had actually been withdrawn, she had stopped trying to interrupt. The confidence in her expression had been replaced with something else, something more desperate, like she was scrambling to find a way out, but couldn't figure out which direction to run. My aunts and uncles, the ones who had once blindly accepted her version of events, started murmuring amongst themselves, exchanging glances that told me everything I needed to know. The spell had broken. The illusion she had spent decades crafting was falling apart, and for the first time, she had nowhere left to hide. She tried one last time to regain control, standing abruptly and throwing her hands in the air like she was the one who had been wronged. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked like this," she snapped, her voice rising as she grabbed her purse. "If you all want to believe this nonsense, then fine, but I don't have to stay here and listen to it." She turned to leave, but my dad, who had spent years letting her get away with things just to avoid conflict, finally spoke up. "You're not leaving until we finish," he said, his voice low but firm, and for the first time in my life, I saw something crack in her expression. She sat back down, but the power she once had over the room was gone. The truth was out, and no amount of twisting the story was going to change that. After my mother finally sat back down, I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface, her hands clenched so tightly around her purse that her knuckles had turned white. She had spent her entire life controlling every conversation, dictating every family narrative, ensuring that she was always seen as the victim while everyone else was cast as the villain. But now, for the first time, the room wasn't bending to her version of events. No one was jumping in to defend her. No one was reassuring her that she had done nothing wrong. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and she had nowhere left to run. My dad, still holding onto the folder of financial records, took a slow breath before speaking again. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of finality that made it clear there was no room left for debate. "You took money that wasn't yours to take. You spent it on things that had nothing to do with Jordan's education. And now that you've been caught, you won't even take responsibility." My mother let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking her head as if the entire conversation was beneath her. "You have no idea what it was like for me," she snapped, her voice dripping with indignation. "I had to make sacrifices, I had to make tough choices, and I did what was best for this family. But of course, none of you ever appreciate that." Jordan, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally let out a sharp breath and sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was quieter than hers, but it carried something heavier: disbelief, exhaustion, maybe even betrayal. "You keep saying you did what was best for the family," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But none of this was for us. You took money that Dad worked for, that was supposed to be for my future, and you used it to live better while telling everyone else that you were struggling." For a split second, I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Panic, maybe, or the realization that Jordan, her perfect son, the one person she had always been able to count on to take her side, was seeing through her lies for the first time. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by another defensive mask. "You have no idea what I went through," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "I did everything for you, for both of you. And this is how I get repaid? With some ridiculous family ambush." I could feel the shift happening in real time. The moment where her usual tactics, playing the martyr, shifting the blame, making herself the victim, were no longer working. The murmurs from the rest of the family were growing louder, the skepticism in their expressions unmistakable. My aunt, who had been one of her biggest defenders in the past, folded her arms tightly across her chest and shook her head. "So let me get this straight," she said, tilting her head slightly. You expect us to believe that you drained an entire education fund, spent thousands of dollars on yourself, and that it was somehow for the good of the family, even though none of us benefited from it except for you. For the first time in my life, my mother had no immediate response. No quick comeback. No perfectly rehearsed excuse. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if she could sense that whatever she said next would only dig her deeper into the hole she had created for herself. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as her confidence finally started to crumble. The rest of the meeting was a slow unraveling of everything she had spent years carefully crafting. My dad made it clear that he would be taking legal steps to ensure she could never access shared family finances again, that she would be held accountable for the money she had taken, whether she liked it or not. My cousins, who had once blindly believed her stories, began sharing their own experiences of her manipulation, connecting the dots in real time as they realized just how often she had twisted situations to her advantage. Even Jordan, who had always seen her through rose-colored glasses, sat there in stunned silence as he processed the truth. By the time she finally stood up to leave, there was no grand exit, no dramatic speech about how we had all betrayed her. She simply grabbed her purse, adjusted her coat, and walked out of the house without looking back. For the first time in my life, she wasn't walking away victorious. She wasn't leaving with the family wrapped around her finger, convinced that she had been wronged. She was leaving alone. Over the next few days, she tried to do damage control, reaching out to different family members, spinning a new version of the story where I had orchestrated the entire meeting out of jealousy and spite. She claimed that I had always been resentful of her, that I had manipulated everyone into turning against her, that this was nothing more than another example of how ungrateful I was. But the difference this time was that no one was buying it. Some relatives ignored her calls entirely, unwilling to get dragged into the mess she had created for herself. Others reached out to me privately, letting me know that they had seen the evidence, that they believed me, that they regretted not questioning her sooner. Even Jordan, despite his initial hesitation, started reaching out more, slowly trying to rebuild the relationship that had been fractured by years of her favoritism and manipulation. My dad wasted no time in making sure she could never take advantage of him again, finalizing legal protections that prevented her from accessing any remaining shared assets. He wasn't interested in revenge. He just wanted to make sure she couldn't continue to exploit anyone else in the family for her own benefit. The most unexpected part of the aftermath was how light everything felt in her absence. Family gatherings, which had once been filled with tension, suddenly felt easier, more relaxed. Conversations weren't dominated by passive-aggressive remarks. Holidays weren't ruined by manufactured drama. And for the first time in years, people actually seemed happy to be around each other. It was like removing her from the equation had lifted a weight that none of us had even realized we had been carrying. She still tried, of course. Every few weeks, she would send a long-winded email or leave a voicemail laced with guilt-tripping, talking about how heartbroken she was, how she had been abandoned by the people she had sacrificed everything for. But the difference now was that no one was listening. I had spent my entire life believing that I would always be the problem, that no matter what I did, I would always be the scapegoat for whatever went wrong. But now, as I stood in the middle of a family gathering that actually felt like family, I realized something I had never thought possible. I wasn't the problem. I never had been.